Welcome, comrades, to the art of cinema.
This is how we do it.
I am Colonel T, Minister of Propaganda of the People's Republic of F.
And I am your glorious leader, General Secretary F. Colonel, I understand that PRF scientists working in your Department of Ideological Conformity have identified The Edge as the 5th best film of the 1990s.
You are correct, as always, sir. The Edge is a screenplay by David Mamet, a fine American writer probably best known for Glengarry Glen Ross. In terms of character development and themes, there's a lot going on in this film.
There is, Colonel, and The Edge stars Anthony Hopkins in the role that the People's Republic of F requires you by law to consider his finest. I'll allow for his part in The Silence of the Lambs, but anyone who picks Hannibal Lecter over his performance here will need to be re-educated.
Sir, Anthony Hopkins is a billionaire in The Edge.
Uh-oh. He's one of the bourgeoisie?
Yes, sir. We don't get details about what he does, but he's someone important. Everyone knows who he is. Everyone respects him, defers to him. He's an older man married to Elle Macpherson, a much younger model. She invites him to come along for a photo shoot of hers, so they take what's planned to be a 36-hour trip to the northern Canadian Rockies. The film presents us with stunning shots of the mountains, sir, and a gorgeous soundtrack by Jerry Goldsmith.
The film submits splendid shots of the mountains to us, Colonel. The film bestows staggering shots of the mountains upon us.
The group arrives at a lodge on a mountain lake in the Canadian Rockies, and we learn that Anthony Hopkins is a savant. He's a voracious reader, a speed reader with a photographic memory. At the lodge, he opens a gift from his secretary, a book about surviving in the wild.
Ah, some foreshadowing. If this had been a PRF production, Anthony Hopkins' secretary would have given him a book about the overthrow of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. You can find any number of those books in our libraries.
Elle Macpherson boasts to the owner of the lodge that her husband, Anthony Hopkins, knows everything. She says the lodge owner couldn't stump Anthony Hopkins. So the lodge owner shows Anthony Hopkins a canoe paddle with a panther carved on one side of the blade and asks him what's carved on the other side of it. It's a rabbit smoking a pipe, says Anthony Hopkins.
Anthony Hopkins just knows that shit?
Yes, sir, he does. He tells us that it's a symbol of the Cree Indians. The rabbit is calm, smoking its pipe because it's unafraid of the panther.
Why is the rabbit unafraid, Colonel?
Because the rabbit is smarter than the panther.
Ah, I see. Just as I am smarter than the counter-revolutionaries, and better armed as well.
But Anthony Hopkins says that his memory is just a freak and not any kind of accomplishment. I seem to retain all these facts, but putting them to any useful purpose is another matter, he tells us. Speaking of foreshadowing, sir, the film establishes that bears are a threat here in the Canadian Rockies. Anthony Hopkins' entourage play a prank on him to surprise him for his birthday. He goes downstairs to make Elle Macpherson a sandwich, and then Alec Baldwin, wearing the hide of a bear, jumps out at him. Anthony Hopkins is terrified. But after they've played their prank, everyone gives Anthony Hopkins birthday presents. Then they all retire for the night because they have to be up for Elle Macpherson's photo shoot in the morning.
I don't know if you want to use shoot and Alec Baldwin in the same sentence.
Elle Macpherson seems to love Anthony Hopkins, but Anthony Hopkins sees her flirting with her photographer, Alec Baldwin, despite her efforts to conceal it. Alec Baldwin is an attractive man Elle Macpherson's age, but he's superficial and arrogant, narcissistic and condescending. At the lodge, Alec Baldwin sees a photograph of an old native hunter and decides that the man is a perfect subject for his photography. So Anthony Hopkins, Alec Baldwin, and Harold Perrineau, who's Alec Baldwin's assistant, leave the cabin to fly up north on an impromptu trip to find and photograph the old hunter.
I'm glad to see that Alec Baldwin might pose a threat to the marriage of Anthony Hopkins and Elle Macpherson. You see, Colonel, the state must replace the two pillars of civil society, church and family. These civil institutions draw people's loyalty away from the state, and the revolution cannot succeed so long as that's the case. So family ties, religion, cultural affiliations, all these things must be undone so that the people see themselves only in relation to the state and its ideology.
On the flight up north, Alec Baldwin and Anthony Hopkins start talking. Alec Baldwin says to Anthony Hopkins, he says, it's a tough row to hoe if you think about it. All that money, all that responsibility, never knowing who your friends are, never knowing what people value you for. Must be tough. Anthony Hopkins asks Alec Baldwin, what do you value me for? Alec Baldwin says, well, I tell you what, I like your style, and I think your wife's pretty cute too. So Anthony Hopkins turns to Alec Baldwin and says, yes. So, how are you planning to kill me?
An outrageous thing to say, Colonel. What's wrong with Anthony Hopkins? I mean, besides the fact that he's an obscenely rich bourgeois oppressor of the common worker.
Confounded, at a loss for words, Alec Baldwin can only stare back at Anthony Hopkins. But before either can say another word, the small plane they're in strikes a flock of migrating geese. They crash into a lake. Anthony Hopkins cuts Harold Perrineau's seatbelt and pulls him out of the wreck as the plane sinks. So Anthony Hopkins, Alec Baldwin, and Harold Perrineau are stranded in the remote Canadian Rockies with no way to call for help. A survival story ensues. It's Anthony Hopkins' ingenuity and leadership that gives the other two men hope. Anthony Hopkins keeps the other two from despair, won't let them give up. He draws on survival knowledge from the book he just read. Anthony Hopkins tells Alec Baldwin and Harold Perrineau, most people lost in the wilds, they die of shame. What did I do wrong? How could I have gotten myself into this? So they sit there and they die, because they didn't do the one thing that could have saved their lives. Thinking. Alec Baldwin asks Anthony Hopkins about what he'd said just before the plane crash. Why would I want to kill you? Asks Alec Baldwin. Anthony Hopkins answers, for my wife and for the money. A disbelieving Alec Baldwin laughs at him and says, you know something, Anthony Hopkins, the rich are different. Anthony Hopkins looks down, reconsidering and ashamed of himself.
It seems that Anthony Hopkins is only an insecure old man, Colonel. He's paranoid because he knows that the workers will rise up and wrest ownership of the society's means of production away from him.
Then, an enormous Kodiak bear finds them. Much of the rest of the film is the story of their desperate effort to escape this bear as it hunts them. The bear is an almost supernatural force. It stalks them day after day. It seems that the bear can read their minds. They don't have time or energy to devote to finding food or getting back to the lodge because it's all spent in panicked flight from the bear. They can't sleep. It's very cold, snowing at times, and they're not dressed for it.
It's as though the bear is a counter-revolutionary who must be purged from the Northern Canadian society by Anthony Hopkins and Alec Baldwin.
The bear gets Harold Perrineau, eats him, leaving just Anthony Hopkins and Alec Baldwin. Alec Baldwin saves Anthony Hopkins' life, and the two start to develop a friendship. But the bear won't let them move around, won't let them eat. So Anthony Hopkins realizes that he's going to have to kill it. He's going to have to face down an overwhelming force that terrifies him. Anthony Hopkins has read about boys in African tribes killing lions with spears. What one man can do, another can do, he tells Alec Baldwin. So Anthony Hopkins lures the bear to them, using himself and Alec Baldwin as bait. He induces the bear to charge and fall on him, then impales the bear on a spear he's cut from tree branches.
It seems the rabbit is smarter than the panther, Colonel, but I don't understand what this film is trying to teach us. Anthony Hopkins is one of the bourgeoisie. Since when did the bourgeoisie purge counter-revolutionaries from their society? The bourgeoisie are counter-revolutionary.
Having killed the bear, Anthony Hopkins and Alec Baldwin have all the meat they can eat and coats to wear from its fur. For Anthony Hopkins, though, it's meant something more. He tells Alec Baldwin, for all my life I've wanted to do something that was unequivocal. And it seems that Anthony Hopkins took what Alec Baldwin told him to heart. Anthony Hopkins' life before all this had been defined by his money. It had been a life in which he didn't know who his friends were or what people valued him for. But here, Alec Baldwin values Anthony Hopkins because they've saved each other's lives. They've overcome impossible odds together. Here, Anthony Hopkins does know who his friends are. Here, in the wilderness of the Canadian Rockies, Anthony Hopkins has at last been able to put all his knowledge to a useful purpose, saving the life of his friend. Anthony Hopkins tells Alec Baldwin that he intends to start his life over. Anthony Hopkins and Alec Baldwin find an abandoned hunting cabin as they trek south. There's a canoe there they can use to travel quickly back towards the lodge. Alec Baldwin finds a rifle and a bottle of whiskey. Anthony Hopkins finds a pot to boil water and make tea. He finds matches and looks around for some paper to use as kindling to fire up the stove. Elle Macpherson had given Anthony Hopkins a pocket watch for his birthday, so he takes the watch's box out of his coat to use the warranty paper for kindling. But when he removes the warranty, a receipt falls out from behind. On the receipt, Anthony Hopkins sees that Elle Macpherson had 2 watches engraved. The engraving on the first reads, "To my beloved husband on his birthday, from the luckiest woman in the world." But the engraving on the second watch reads, "To Alec Baldwin from Elle Macpherson for all the nights." Alec Baldwin comes back inside and starts drinking the whiskey, loading the rifle. Anthony Hopkins asks to see his watch, but Alec Baldwin won't show it to him. Now they both know that they both know. So as Alec Baldwin keeps loading the rifle, Anthony Hopkins says, "What's the matter, Alec Baldwin? Can't do it sober?"
Excellent. So Alec Baldwin will shoot down Anthony Hopkins, and in so, he'll kill two birds with one stone, Colonel. He'll rid Northern Canadian Rocky society of this rich bourgeois oppressor, and he'll strike a blow against the institution of marriage and family, which divides a people's loyalty away from the state. Truly, Colonel, Alec Baldwin is the hero of The Edge.
Alec Baldwin takes Anthony Hopkins outside to shoot him. Anthony Hopkins had been right about everything from the start. Alec Baldwin had been planning to kill him to get at his wife and his money, and that plan hasn't changed even now that Anthony Hopkins has saved Alec Baldwin's life and become his friend. But before he can shoot Anthony Hopkins, Alec Baldwin falls backward into a bear trap and impales his leg.
No, not Alec Baldwin. He was just about to shoot Anthony Hopkins.
Even now that Alec Baldwin has attempted the ultimate betrayal, though, Anthony Hopkins won't abandon him. He tourniquets Alec Baldwin's leg and nurses his wound, keeps him warm. He gets them both into the canoe and takes them south, back towards the lodge. But Alec Baldwin, still consumed with envy, falls into despair. It's an injury he could physically survive, but he says, "I'm dying, and I never did a goddamn thing." He tells Anthony Hopkins, I'm sorry for what I did. And he assures Anthony Hopkins that Elle Macpherson was never in on the plan to kill him. Seeing that he's giving up, Anthony Hopkins tells him, "Don't die on me, Alec Baldwin." Just then, a helicopter flies into the valley looking for them. Anthony Hopkins signals it and they see him. But when Anthony Hopkins looks back, with rescue finally at hand, he sees that Alec Baldwin has died. Alec Baldwin has died of shame. When he arrives back at the lodge, Anthony Hopkins smiles at Elle Macpherson and hugs her, but then puts Alec Baldwin's watch in her hand. The press is there, asking him what happened. Anthony Hopkins tells them, "We're all put to the test, but it never comes in the form or at the point we would prefer, does it?" When the press asks what happened to his friends, Anthony Hopkins says, as he holds back tears, "They died, saving my life."
There's one victor in this story, Elle Macpherson. Her marriage is clearly over now that Anthony Hopkins has discovered her affair. She's been liberated from that medieval institution. The veil that hid Elle Macpherson's degradation has been rent. She now stands unencumbered before the state, free to drink deep from the waters of progress that flow from her glorious leader, General Secretary F.
Indeed, sir. Strangely, in The Edge, the rich man is the admirable one. The rich man is more intelligent than the others. He's more kind, more generous. It's the rich man in Anthony Hopkins who's a real friend, selfless and forgiving, even after Alec Baldwin's terrible betrayals.
And it's sad to see this regression in the ideology that informs Hollywood films. PRF agents working in Hollywood have made real progress in ensuring that the rich are always portrayed as villains. But here, we have a delusional fantasy in which we're meant to admire the rich man. Remember, though, that Hollywood also makes movies about flying superheroes with lasers that shoot from their eyes. We shouldn't take Anthony Hopkins in The Edge any more seriously than we take Superman, then. These characters are mere adolescent fantasy, Colonel. And adolescence is an apt comparison for the United States in its current stage of development. We all entertained ridiculous ideas when we were teenagers, just as the Americans today make films like The Edge. The difference, though, is that a young person simply grows out of adolescence. For the U.S. to move past capitalist imperialism, on the other hand, that will only be possible through the atrocity visited upon them with the sweeping advance of PRF service personnel and people who march in fine array, arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, following the leadership of the respected comrade General Secretary F.
This has been The Art of Cinema with our glorious leader, General Secretary F. Let us maintain vigilance against the ever-looming threat of an American invasion. You are required to report any non-participation or dissent amongst your comrades. Don't forget to tune in to The Art of Cinema again next time to find out which film from the 1990s is ranked at number 6 in your next mandatory re-education session.